My name's A.J. Kramer. I'm the federal public defender in Washington, D.C., where nothing is going on nowadays, so I can get out of town and spend some time here. Very little activity going on in D.C. To do with anything. We have a very distinguished panel. We're going to talk about probably the broadest subject on the whole program, which is criminal justice reform, which encompasses so many things that I'm sure we will not touch on all of them. We will touch on some of them. And so I feel like we have a new audience, and I have to tell my DC joke again. And maybe the three of them will laugh again, although I doubt it. This sums up, we have an incredibly distinguished panel that I'll introduce to you in a minute. They put the fool up to be the moderator for the panel, so that's why I'm here. So I will tell you in a nutshell a story from DC that tells what I think the problem is and the prospects are for criminal justice reform. I was out to dinner and the four surgeons were at the next table and they were talking about the easiest people to operate on. And the first surgeon says, librarians are the easiest people to operate on. You cut them open and everything has a little number with a decimal point even, and you just put it back together. It's very simple. And the second surgeon goes, no, electricians are the easiest people to operate on. You open them up and it's red to red and white to white and yellow to yellow. It's very simple. And the third doctor goes, no, auto mechanics are the easiest people to operate on. You open them up. They don't mind if it takes twice as long as you told them, if it costs twice as much, and if you have a few parts left over at the end. They don't mind. And the fourth doctor goes, no, really, politicians are the easiest people to operate on. You open them up, there's no brains, there's no heart, there's no guts, and the head and the rear end are interchangeable. So that, to me, is the problem with criminal justice reform in a nutshell. Now, in a much more intellectual way, our panelists will tell you about criminal justice reform, and we have an incredibly distinguished panel. On my far left is Jenny Kim from the Koch, who is the Koch company's Deputy General Counsel for Political Law and Vice President for Public Policies, and on the board of the Coalition for Public Safety. But she's not just that's not all she does. She's also the janitor, therapist, and henchman in the office for everybody. John Malcolm is in the middle from the Heritage Foundation, the Gilbertson Senior Legal Fellow and Director of the Heritage Foundation's Edward Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He also has styled himself as a smart-ass lawyer who bores most people to tears. That's his description, not mine. And finally, on the end, John Rapping, who started out as a public defender in Washington, D.C. years ago in the local public defender office, PDS, and has done an incredible job founding and taking Gideon's promises to heights that I think maybe even he never envisioned, the incredible job it's done with training and preparing public defenders. I knew him long ago as a no-hit, no-field left fielder on a softball team that we played on together. So I want to start with, the subject of criminal justice reform has been in the news recently. It's gotten a lot of attention. Unfortunately, not nearly enough. I think we can all three agree on this, that not nearly enough is being actually done about it. It's very difficult for politicians. It's a long-term project with long-term, and there's causes of it that go way back further. And so I want to know, Jenny, if you can start, what is Koch still concentrating on this issue, which they have been doing for quite a while now, and what specifically are they trying to do?
So we are still fully committed and focused on the issue, and the way we view it is we have 5 buckets. The first part is the way the laws are written. We think that all laws should have a criminal intent built into it, and that if there is any lack of clarity in the law, then the defendant should get the benefit of the doubt. We also care about civil forfeiture reform as well, but we also talk to the law enforcement community to make sure we understand, what their objections sometimes are and what their needs are as well. We also look at prosecutorial overreach and materiality reform and Brady reform. We also work on indigent/public defense, We think that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel is a very important right. Basically, we care about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And then the fourth part is the sentencing reform, and then finally it's collateral consequences and reentry. Those are the 5 big components that we work on. In the prior session, John Malcolm mentioned all the other sort of bits and pieces that kind of flow into the system, like diversion and pretrial, et cetera. And those are things that we are happy to help our allies on connecting to each other, but we don't work on those per se directly. And then there's also an institute called Charles Koch Institute, and they also fund a lot of higher education research. There's a request for proposal out for criminal justice studies for professors, and there's also policy experts there as well, and they also work on policing in addition to the subjects that I just mentioned.
Thank you. I should have added at the beginning, please, we're going to talk about things. We obviously want to address anything you have in mind too. So if you have questions, comments, please, as we go along, just let me know and we'll discuss them and talk about them. Even if we have to shift what we're talking about, we're happy to talk about. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We hope that you want to know about these things, but we're even more happy to talk about if you have specific concerns and questions. So please ask us as we go along. John Malcolm, you heard what Jenny said. What's the Heritage Foundation's view of, or your personal view? I don't know if some people have disclaimers, but what's your view of what comprehensive criminal justice reform involves and what are the prospects for it?
Let me supplement your introduction just very briefly in terms of my bona fides for this. I actually spent 10 years as a federal prosecutor. I was a career prosecutor for 7 years, and then I was a deputy assistant attorney general in the criminal division for 3. I've also was a defense attorney for a while, and I've, in various different jobs, dealt with law enforcement officials, not only in this country, but actually all over the world. Look, criminal justice, it's a very exciting time for criminal justice reform. I know that some people are very depressed that criminal justice reform didn't get done in Congress last year. There are reasons for that which we can discuss. And something unusual from the Heritage Foundation, I'm actually going to say something nice about President Obama, who during his term really did a lot to raise the profile of the criminal justice problems in the criminal justice system. I give him a great deal of credit for that, including on his way out the door, writing a rather scholarly article that appeared in the Harvard Law Review, where he used to serve as president. There were certain aspects of the criminal justice reform efforts, such as mens rea reform, that I wish had been relegated to more than just the footnote that it was in the Obama article, but there we are. Criminal justice reform cuts across a broad swath of issues. So there's mens rea reform, which has to do with really fundamentally what is the moral force behind the criminal law and what ought to be a crime. How should one define a crime? And then there's issues related to diversion, sentencing reform, prison reform, which is essentially what do you do with prisoners once you have them incapacitated? Should you do something to try to help them improve their lives and also help public safety by reducing the risk that they're going to recidivate upon release? Then there are collateral consequences, which we can get into and which cut across a huge swath of issues, and little other pieces, juvenile justice reform, et cetera, body cameras, policing reform. It's a whole host of areas, each of which is important, each of which probably deserve different emphasis in different communities. And even though criminal justice reform failed in the last Congress, both the House and Senate leaders have said that it still remains an important issue that they would like to take up again this congressional term, perhaps after the presidential election. Now that we know the results, people will try to work to come together with something that will work for both parties. But even if they don't, I still have to say that, so there are roughly 2.2 million people at any given time incarcerated in this country. About 200,000 of them are federal inmates. 2 million of them are state inmates. And criminal justice reform has been continuing apace now at the state level for quite some time, and will continue to do so for reasons that we can also explore in red, purple, and blue states. In terms of the Heritage Foundation's interest in this, actually the center that I oversee is named after our 75th Attorney General, Ed Meese. He referred to that. This began with Ed Meese. I mean, Ed Meese, when he finished up, or actually when he was still at the Department of Justice as Attorney General, focused on an aspect of the problem, and it's a real aspect of the problem, which is over-federalization, which is to say that we now have complementary jurisdiction over a whole host of what used to be considered just state crimes. States, after all, are supposed to have the primary police power in this country. And our conceptions about how broad the federal government's jurisdiction over crime ought to be and what ought to constitute criminal conduct, federal criminal violations of federal criminal law, has dramatically expanded. And Ed Meese was a very, very early person saying this is a problem that we ought to recognize, and the problem has only gotten worse since then. He has also been a proponent for a long time on things like mens rea reform and even on forms of things like civil asset forfeiture reform. So the Heritage Foundation has been involved in this. It's a little unusual for the Heritage Foundation. We find ourselves having what I guess most people would term as occasional strange bedfellows. We've worked with the ACLU. We work regularly with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. We've even on occasion worked with the Center for American Progress. A colleague of mine refers to this sometimes as the island of misfit toys or the barroom scene from Star Wars. I think both of those are apt analogies, but it's an effort that I think we're going to continue to pursue. We don't all agree, for obvious reasons, on what the problems are. We don't even agree on what the causes of the problems are, and we don't always agree on what the solutions should be. It's a very elaborate Venn diagram, but there is a sweet spot in which we do agree. If we don't recognize why it's a problem, we at least recognize that it is a problem, and we also agree on some of the things that ought to be done to address the problem. So we're going to continue doing that.
Ed Meese, who John talked about, must have gotten that concern about the criminal justice system from attending the finest public law school in the country, which I say that because I also happen to attend that law school several years after him. He's a little disarray. Yes. Yeah, they're at Berkeley, but not the law school. In any event, the law school's searching for a dean now, the past 2 deans having been dismissed for sexual harassment and misconduct. John, I know you have a viewpoint on this discussion about reform of the criminal justice, and we have touched on, by the first 2, touched on a huge range of topics. We're obviously not going to get to all of them, but John, I know you have a viewpoint about the way reform of the system can happen that requires public defenders. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. How's everyone doing this morning? Great. So, John, I'm not sure if you stepped off the island of misfit toys or you've invited us onto it, but it's good to be with you, at least for this next hour. We actually did this session an hour ago, and what I said was so brilliant. Literally, everyone stood up and collectively said, that guy was brilliant. So I'm going to just repeat it. I
guess I missed that part of it.
I'm going to try to repeat it verbatim. So John mentioned this law review article that President Obama authored before leaving the White House, published in the Harvard Law Review, and he mentioned that mens rea was relegated to a footnote. Public defenders, the men and women who literally represent 80% of the people in the criminal justice system, weren't mentioned at all, literally absent from the conversation. I say that not as a dig at Barack Obama. In fact, I agree with John that Barack Obama did more as a president to advance criminal justice reform than his predecessors. He held a panel discussion at the White House. He's spoke about it eloquently. He has the first sitting president to visit a federal prison. I think the lack of public defenders mentioned in the law review article is less a reflection of President Obama and more a reflection of what is missing from the national conversation about criminal justice reform, because I, like all of us, have been elated that over the last 2.5 years as a nation, in a bipartisan fashion, we have become focused on the crisis in criminal justice. But as I read reports and read articles and listen to panel discussions, almost to a discussion, almost to an article, almost to a report, public defenders are literally absent from the conversation. And I think that's because the people who are having these conversations, it's not that they don't appreciate public defenders. I think it's that we've come to see public defenders' role as only narrowly representing one individual at a time in a case-by-case basis. We don't have an analysis of how public defenders contribute to systemic reform. I actually think that's a fatal flaw in the conversation, and I'm going to tell you why. When I started my career in D.C., as AJ said, which is really a model state-level public defender office. By the time I was doing serious felonies, I never had more than 20 cases. I had investigators, I had resources. And then in 2004, I moved to Georgia to join the effort to launch a statewide public defender system in Georgia. 2 years later, after Katrina hit, I went to New Orleans to help with the effort to rebuild that public defender office. I did some work in Alabama and Mississippi. And it was my introduction to how indigent defense and criminal justice looks in the rest of the world. I realized how for 10 years I was in a bubble when it comes to understanding criminal justice. And so that really led to me and my wife founding Gideon's Promise. And the idea behind Gideon's Promise was to build a community, a movement of public defenders, to change the way we think about poor people and the justice they demand, to infuse humanity into the criminal justice system, to challenge our assumptions about criminal justice, and to therefore drive reform in some of the most broken systems. And as I started thinking about building Gideon's Promise, I started doing research on this idea of organizational culture. And what I found was that really no one in the criminal justice arena was talking about culture. But the people that really talk about culture quite a bit, organizational culture, are in the business arena. Heads of CEOs understand that culture shapes people, that culture defines the success and failures of organizations. And as I started reading more about leadership, I came across a theory called adaptive leadership. It's a phrase coined by two leadership experts, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And what adaptive leadership tells us is that there really are two types of challenges that we face as leaders. There are technical challenges and there are adaptive challenges. And Heifetz and Linsky would say that the greatest failure of leaders is to try to apply technical solutions to adaptive problems. So for example, in the public defender arena, if AJ learned that none of his lawyers were going to the jail to visit their clients, and he found out that the reason was because the jail won't let lawyers in after 5 p.m. and all of his lawyers are in court before 5. That's a technical problem. He can fix that by going to the jail and getting that policy changed. But if he learned that his lawyers weren't going to the jail, not because they didn't have access, but because they really didn't understand how communicating with clients was valuable. They sort of felt like, these clients, they tell you stories, they lead you on a wild goose chase, they get in the way of my ability to save them. Right? If that's the challenge, then by applying a technical solution, AJ would fail. If AJ could try to solve that problem by saying, every lawyer must visit the jail 20 hours a week. And the lawyers might visit 20 hours a week, and they'd sit across from their client and they would say, listen, I got 5 more minutes, just shut up. I just got to get through 5 more minutes this week. I need to log that, right? But it really doesn't solve the problem, right? That's an adaptive challenge. It requires changing the way lawyers understand clients and the importance of client communications and learning clients' priorities and cases. So I say all that to say that what I believe is that in this criminal justice debate, we focus a lot on technical solutions to symptoms of a broader problem. If the problem is that there are too many people in prison, mass incarceration, if we just engage in sentencing reform, we can reduce the number of people in prison. If we just engage in decriminalization, we can reduce the number of people brought into the system. But if we don't change the fact that we see certain communities as more dangerous, that we see certain communities as needing to be more closely monitored, controlled, locked up, we will continue to disproportionately monitor those communities, arrest those communities, prosecute those communities, incarcerate those communities. We won't have equal justice. We just might have less injustice. And the problem is we are not looking at an adaptive solution. The adaptive solution really is getting us to change our assumptions about the people that we target. So there's a lot of research on this idea of implicit bias, particularly implicit racial bias. The idea that all of us, even the most well-intentioned of us, harbor a belief that there is a connection between skin color and dangerousness. And I look at that and I see it drive really well-intentioned public defenders, prosecutors, judges, police. It doesn't mean that these are bad people. Matter of fact, I think many of them truly are committed to and believe they're doing justice. But until we change a narrative that sees certain people as less worthy of protection, as more dangerous, all of these other reforms won't get us equal justice. It might shrink the system, but it won't get us equal justice. So that brings me to public defenders. Why do public defenders matter? And why are they critical to this larger conversation? 80% of the people in the system are represented by public defenders. I know from experience, I believe the social science when it says that the best way to get people to change their assumptions and their biases is to get them close to the people that they make decisions about, is to introduce them to the stories, introduce them to who the people are. If we all are in a system because we are overwhelmed and processing large numbers of cases where we just view someone charged with robbery as a robber, someone charged with drug dealing as a drug dealer, then it is easier to process them. And instead of being Jimmy Jones, their number 56892, it's easier to process them. And as lawyers become storytellers and they start forcing us to understand the humanity of people, forcing us to understand their stories, we start to challenge assumptions, we start to change values and behavior, we start to address the adaptive challenge. I think public defenders, as the voice of communities most impacted, are critical to that. It is the critical piece missing from this larger discussion, which is a discussion of policies that I think are absolutely critical to discuss. They just simply aren't enough.
John, Malcolm, is that right? Are public defenders needed in this? I don't know if it's a dialogue, it's a multi-faceted groups. And how do we get past the perception that public defenders, well, we're just the ones who represent these folks, so of course we're going to say these things. How do we get past that?
Well, so it was interesting in our last discussion, John said some things that sort of led me off on a diatribe.
Right.
And they, he tailored his remarks. I don't know whether he did it intentionally or not. I really didn't disagree with much of what he said. I think that if we're going to have a sensible discussion, that a variety of voices need to be heard, and that federal defenders and state defenders, defense attorneys in general, are an important part of that discussion. I agree with him that they are overworked and under-resourced. I think that criminal defense attorneys, I mean, you know, people will go, oh, terrible, they're just representing bad people. Well, sometimes they are bad people, but they are accused of crimes until they are convicted of crimes, and they are entitled to have their advocate who's going to tell their story and to put the government to its paces. And convicting somebody of a crime shouldn't be overly difficult, but it should not be like shooting fish in a barrel either. And I think defense attorneys play an incredibly vital role in our process, and it is very important that their voices and the voices of their clients and the communities that they come from are heard from. I think you need to hear from a panoply of voices. I think you need to hear from prosecutors. I think you need to hear from community leaders. I think you need to hear from victims' rights organizations. I think you need to hear from just average mom and pop folks living in those communities, and they need to have an open dialogue with the police about how they can best address in a way that is fair and is perceived to be fair by everybody whose interests are involved. And so, I agree. I also would not dispute that police officers, lawyers, doctors, every single person in this room, we all have our biases, explicit biases, implicit biases. The degree to which that implicit bias rules us, I think the social science is somewhat inconclusive, but I'm not going to deny the existence of implicit bias that we all have in many of its manifestations. Look, I do think that the police and people who are dealing with crimes, they will have to fight their explicit and implicit biases. But I do think that they have a very, very difficult job. They are also under-resourced. and they encounter often, sometimes they contribute to, but often they encounter problems that were not of their making. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't focus on police training and dealing with biases in community relations and trying to improve both effective policing and effective community relations. But there's an awful lot that's going on here. Poor educational opportunities, fentanyl problem, gang problem, cartels fighting over turf, bad family structures, poor educational and economic opportunities in these communities, the deinstitutionalization movement that happened in the 60s and 70s, so that we now have a lot more mentally ill people who are being undertreated or untreated, who are in our communities causing problems. Police officers who are not, after all, lawyers, judges, psychiatrists, psychopharmacologists, educators, social workers, all rolled into one person, often end up having to respond to these problems. But look, the importance of federal defenders, both in our system and in terms of getting their voices heard as part of this process, is incredibly important.
Jenny, before I get to you, to ask you to comment, there's a question in the back.
Yes, I had a question for the gentleman from the Heritage Foundation and the Code organization. Do either of those organizations take a look and study the effects of income inequality as being perhaps a primary source of the problem, the over-criminalization, the over-incarceration of citizens in the United States?
So what's
You said two organizations, Heritage and what is the other organization?
Jenny, the code.
Oh.
So what you're talking, what's commonly called now the poverty to prison pipeline. So maybe Jenny, you can start since John and try to answer that question about.
So the corporation does not study that directly, but the Charles Koch Foundation gives out grants to study some of that, and the studies are sort of still in process right now, so I can't speak to them currently at this moment. But look, I mean, I think there is a tendency to criminalize the poor. But I also think that, I mean, the cultural stuff that John Rapping talked about, I don't know if anyone's, excuse me, been paying attention to the super zip codes, but I mean, we tend to isolate ourselves from a lot of experiences. And the thing that struck me as we got involved in this whole work was, do we have the right dictionary with the right terms? Because oftentimes, in our well-meaning way, we talk about, reforming certain things, but then when you talk to the people who are actually affected by it, is that really a problem? And even if you use the same term, are you actually referring to different things? And that has been probably the most difficult part of all this work, is that, yes, everybody wants reform, everybody thinks there's some cause, problem, solution, but even though we're using the same terms, we may mean totally different things. And so with respect to income inequality and so forth, I think from our perspective, we view it as removing barriers to opportunity and to figure out how to get people access. Johnny Taylor of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, who recently received a grant from the Koch Foundation and Koch Industries, he doesn't want to talk about poor people because he said it's really about fragile communities. Because you can be poor but still emotionally thriving. And he said most of the time, the people who get into trouble within the systems, all the systems, are the ones who are probably economically deprived, but also as well as emotionally deprived, and having not a sense of themselves and being proud and confident despite obstacles and believing that you can do it. And he talked about his experience going to the barbershop a couple weeks before election, and he said that there, it wasn't really about race or policing. It was ultimately, at the end of the day, about opportunity and the lack of access to them, or being able to figure out a way out of the tunnel of darkness that they were in. And similarly, Freedom Partners went to visit a black church, an African-American church in Baltimore near the Freddie Gray area, and they, Vote America Now, hosted a panel with one of the Maryland state representatives, Mark Holden, who spoke yesterday. And the interesting thing is that it was people from the neighborhood who spoke about their aspirations and hopes. But the thing that struck all of us the most was they weren't interested in the D or R politics of anything. They just wanted to be safe. They just wanted to know that their kids may have a better life. But they were reluctant to believe anyone who kind of brought that sort of propaganda to them, because for the last 20 to 30 years, it's just gotten worse. It's not gotten better. And I think, it struck me that going into those communities is really important, because we're all up on Capitol Hill or the state capitals trying to make policies that affect people's lives positively. But the reality is we also need to understand what those folks perceive as the problems before we can solve them.
And John, can you answer her question about?
Yeah, well, I endorse everything Jenny just said. I mean, income inequality is somewhat of a politically loaded term. If your question is income inequality per se the driver of crime, I would just note that there is an imperfect correlation, to put it mildly, between times of economic stress in our country and crime rates. And so there are many, many factors that probably change over time that contribute to our crime rate. And if you wish to think that income inequality is the primary driver, that's okay. I don't look for sort of this is causing that, and even the phrase income inequality, it's like, is that a problem just because there is income disparity, or is it a question of a lack of opportunities that prevent people from diminishing that disparity? I don't look at one thing and say it's this is the big problem, and here's the solution to that, and that is what's causing the crime problem. So if you're asking, has the Heritage Foundation, or for that matter any other organization, looked and said it is this that is causing that, the answer would be no.
John, wrapping, obviously your clients, my clients, are all what we would, from the lower income. What do you think about that?
So, we talked about this in the last panel a little bit, and I think I don't necessarily believe that people who have lower incomes commit more crimes. I believe that we make a decision to police the kinds of crimes more commonly committed by people who have lower incomes. So, for example, I teach law school, which is my paying job. I'm a professor at Atlanta's John Marshall Law School. I work in one of the very few law schools in the country. I don't know if any law school has more diversity when it comes to African American students than John Marshall. Our student body is probably roughly 50% African American. So I teach criminal procedure. I teach criminal justice lawyering. My classes always have a really good division between African American students and white students. And Jenny brought up in the last conversation, which I agree, that there are obviously many other racial and ethnic groups in America. But for law schools, it's pretty remarkable to be in a classroom where you have roughly half the class is African American. And those students, when we talk about criminal procedure, most of my African American male students have experienced being pulled over by police for things that they believe they did not do. Most of my white male students have not had that experience. So I think that these implicit biases cause, and I'm not saying these are bad police officers, I think we are driven by biases that may cause us to police certain communities. I think race plays a role. I think class plays a role. So if you look at college campuses, I don't know the statistics, but I know there is a high incidence of drug use, of underage alcohol consumption, because I did go to college. I didn't participate in that, but I was there.
Nor did I, or anybody else on this panel.
High incidence of sexual assaults. But we don't have the same level of policing, not because the crime doesn't exist, but because we make choices as a society about where to police. So when we talk about the poverty to prison pipeline, I don't know if it's so much about poor people committing more crimes or us choosing to focus our law enforcement resources disproportionately on poor communities and communities of color. and again, I'm going to be repetitive. I don't mean to suggest because bad people are running the system. It's because we are all shaped by biases.
Can I just say one?
Yeah,
quick
but
thing?
not for a sec, because there's a question, okay?
Well, I would like to say just a couple sentences directly responsive, and then I'm happy to.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I don't disagree with what John just said, other than to say that it does make a certain amount of sense to focus police resources, which are also very limited, and you have to pick and choose the crimes you're going to do. And it is a fact. You can just see this from the FBI crime statistics and from statistics reported to police authorities that at the moment, the overwhelming majority of violent crimes are happening not in all urban areas, but in some major urban areas, and so it at least makes some sense, regardless of how you do the policing, with all of your explicit and implicit biases, to at least focus law enforcement resources in an area to try to address the serious fentanyl, opioid, and violent crime problems that are happening in some urban areas. With that, I'm defer to the question.
I don't want to have my silence mean that I agree with what John Malcolm just said, but I want to get to the, I want to get, I want to get to the question, yeah.
Is, there's a huge disparity in income in this country right now. And does the Heritage Foundation feel like affording more opportunities for lower income people to rise up to the middle class? Because right now it feels like we've got a lower class and we've got an upper class. We don't have a middle class. Has anybody made a study about that in terms of being able to afford these people who have the intellectual horsepower to move up to the middle class?
Absolutely. That the Heritage Foundation is all about removing barriers to economic mobility in all of its manifestations, from educational reform to deregulatory efforts to just across a whole panoply of efforts. Anything that will increase social and economic mobility, the Heritage Foundation is involved in.
Yeah, I don't have any doubt that the Koch Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, are all in favor of trying to equal out opportunities for everyone in the country. I think obviously there's differences in what people believe how that should be accomplished. But yeah, go ahead.
For instance, in the state of Kansas, all small business owners are given a buy in terms of having to pay taxes. And pages and pages and pages and pages of businesses in Kansas. You've got rural communities in Kansas that are just like ghost towns, because and nobody's doing anything about it. So I don't see how that's any kind of a movement toward the middle class.
That sounds like a question for Jenny.
So I think with the Kansas budget being that it is, the situation there is a little bit complicated. We don't anticipate anything being done, but I think your point is well taken. I think Mike Rowe talks about this a lot with respect to the perceived lack of income mobility. And I think what he would say, and I think to a certain extent this is right, is that he said that we've sort of lured everyone into this dream of everyone going to college and everyone finding a job with a BA. The reality is, with a Bachelor of Arts, good luck finding a job nowadays. It's very hard. On the other hand, there's like about 5.3 million jobs unfilled right now for welding, pipe fitting, a lot of sort of more vocational jobs, and they pay well. You can do a lot of things with it. There's a lot of mobility. A lot of the jobs are coming back into the United States in some respects. So I think there needs to be different levels of probably educational opportunity for people, and not this whole one-size-fits-all where the high school counselor says, you need to go to college and have more debt and be happy even though you're up in a debt into your eyeballs, and kind of help people really figure out, because right now, yes, there's the bottom and then there's the top. There seems to be no middle, but at the same time, I don't think that our educational system does a good job of articulating what other opportunities are out there except for college.
John Rapping, you got any comments on the income mobility problem? Or no. So let me, yeah.
It's a different subject. So
That's all right. No, please.
I have a couple questions, but I think the one I really want to ask is,
a lot of the focus, obviously, of these reforms are on things that happen on the back end. The collateral consequences, to some degree, the sentencing reforms. It makes me sick when I think of how many, 97% of cases, state and federally, are resolved by plea. I guess my question is this: what can we do? What sort of ways can you direct reforms that would happen more on the front end, so that we don't have to worry about how to mitigate collateral consequences, how to mitigate mandatory minimums, et cetera? Is there something we can do on the front end?
Sure, I mean, and that's all part of the criminal justice system reform problem. The front end is people come before they, are you talking about before they come in a system period, or at the very beginning of the journey?
Mostly what I'm talking about is would you advocate for reforms that would make it such that the person wouldn't end up with a felony conviction at all?
Okay, yes, please.
So there are several different ways to address that. One I've talked about yesterday, which is mens rea reform, which in part is how do you define a crime in the first place. The second is more robust use of diversion programs when appropriate to get people sort of out of the criminal justice system, give them a second chance, to address if there were any underlying problems, such as mental health issues, substance abuse issues, et cetera, returning veterans with PTSD that were a precipitating factor in committing the crime in the first place. I think that somewhat moderating in appropriate ways minimum mandatory sentences, which create a real incentive for people to charge bargain their way out from mandatory minimum sentences. And I think that one of the issues that John addressed, which is making sure that criminal defense attorneys are adequately resourced so that they can spend the time that is necessary with their clients in order to come up with a just and fair resolution of the case, and aren't simply rushing people through the system and getting them to plead guilty because simply they don't have the time to do an adequate investigation.
There's another, hold off one sec, there's one more question in the back.
Well, I'm probably coming from the left field here, but has anyone on the panel ever, or your groups ever taken a stand on certain politicians who say we've got to get tougher on crime and insist on more penalties, but yet when it comes to paying for extra judges, extra prisons, guards, POs, all the additional expenses, has any of your groups ever come out and say, wait a second, you can't do one unless you do the other?
Why don't you finish answering the previous
So I
Yeah,
wanna-
you answered the previous.
I
yeah.
do have one thought. I will pass the mic on the gentleman's question, but I do have one thought about the woman's question in the back. So I agree with John that I may prioritize it even higher, that lawyers, and because we're talking about a system that largely is about people who require public defenders are meant to be a friction that makes it difficult to get from arrest to conviction. Public defenders have been so under-resourced, so overwhelmed, and so beaten down that literally they've become a lubricant. And we have a hypothetical that we work with our lawyers. And for those of you in federal court, you'll say, oh my gosh, this couldn't happen. This is the reality for some public defenders in state court. We have a hypothetical where we say you are getting new clients today, and you get 20 new cases. And the prosecutor, and it's 10 in the morning, and your court starts at 1, and they will start processing cases at 1. Prosecutor comes to you with a deal for one of your clients who's charged with armed robbery. And the deal is, if your client will plead guilty today to robbery, we will not oppose release and probation. If they don't plead guilty today, the deal's off the table, and you know they will probably get a bond they cannot make, and they will sit in jail for several months waiting for trial. You also have a basic police report that suggests there are some real ripe avenues for investigation, and there are some collateral consequences. Your client has a government job and lives in subsidized housing. And you have about 15 minutes to talk to your client. And how do you do that? And quite honestly, most public defenders make a decision based on that piece of paper. What the right result is, they convince the client to do something without any conversation. They're helping grease this system. And so I think we absolutely need public defenders to have resources, but where does that come from? I think part of the reform it goes back to, it's an adaptive challenge. We have prosecutors that somehow don't feel they're violating their ethical obligation, asking lawyers to help clients decide a really important decision when the lawyer can't possibly live up to their fundamental obligations under the rules of professional responsibility. They can't begin to do any investigation. They can't begin to look into motions. And what I always say is this: if we had a Department of Transportation that was funded for 100 miles of highway, but the public was crying for 500 miles of highway, and the head of the Department of Public Transportation said, I'm elected, we will use the 100 miles of highway worth of money and build 500 miles worth of broken highway, knowing there will be car crashes and lives hang in the balance, the head of that department would be run out of town on a rail. But yet, prosecutors, and I don't mean this as a knock of prosecutors, this is about culture. Prosecutors do that every day. The public is demanding they pump more cases into the system than the system is resourced to handle. Facing political pressure, and I think in some ways coming to believe what they're doing is actually justice, they do that, and they see their job as getting the case in the system and to conviction as quickly as possible. And really the right response is prosecutors have their hand on the spigot. They have to say, we can only handle 100 units of justice. We only have funding for 100 units of justice. The public demands 500 units. You know what, public? I have a job to do, and it's higher than my obligation is higher than what you want. I'm going to turn the spigot off. I've got to decide which 100 units of cases to prosecute. That happens nowhere. And so to me, it's an adaptive challenge. It goes back to those of us who teach law school. We have to educate future lawyers differently. In the system, we have to educate criminal justice professionals. When they see something happening that is causing lawyers to fall below the constitutional and professional standards, they have to say, stop, I can't be a part of this. That happens almost nowhere.
I'm very sorry about your question.
I'm sorry.
John and John, okay, you can say yes probably, but you need to catch a
I've
plane,
got 3
right?
minutes, and I'll
Okay.
attempt to answer your question because you were respectful and waited. So the first thing I would say is I'm not in the business of criticizing anybody, but I am in the business of trying to bring fiscal reality to the situation. I would note that there was a lot of progress, as I said before, being made in the states. That progress was initiated because states all of a sudden were finding themselves in huge recessions, and they noticed that other than Medicaid, the fastest growing portions of their budgets had to do with the criminal justice system. So in part, what prompted them to do this was a sense of fiscal reality, because guess what? They actually had to manage budgets or raise taxes on their citizens, either of which was going to be a loser politically for them. With respect to the federal system, one of the arguments that I've made against mandatory minimum sentences, I'm not against mandatory minimum sentences. One of the arguments I've made about tempering certain mandatory minimum sentences is to say, look, we are facing extreme budgetary pressure. I do not think we are about to go on a federal prison expansion program anytime soon. And you are locking up some very low-level offenders for extremely long periods of time in a prison cell, and that prison cell is incredibly valuable real estate that ought to be used for the person who is posing the greatest threat to public safety, and you should temper some of these minimum mandatory sentences so that instead of locking up one person for 15 years, you're perhaps locking up 3 people for 5 years. And I did that not on the basis of the system systemically racist or this, that, or the other, on the basis of just it's a prudent use of resources tempered with fiscal realities, and I think that needs to be part of the discussion.
So John and John have to catch planes. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the 3 panelists.